So this chapter, we're going to be looking at things like the scientific method. We're going to talk about how to report some of those measurements we've been looking at, and doing some simple calculations that's going to set us up for a lot of the things we're going to be doing this year. So in this particular section, again, we'll look at the scientific method, distinguish between different types of observations, which are going to be important for your lab reports, and talk about the differences between hypothesis, theories, and models. A lot of things that you probably think you have an idea of, but the scientific definition might be a little bit different. So first off, the scientific method. We've probably all learned about this in like middle school, elementary school. I remember in my 6th grade class, there were posters on the wall with like a nice step 1, step 2, step 3. Well, every book presents it differently, but there's not necessarily one set of steps for the scientific method. It's really just the idea that we can take a logical approach to solve a problem. So you observe and collect data, you make hypotheses, you test your hypothesis, and then you make a theory that's supported by all the data you made or collected. Thinking about maybe a cell phone, maybe you have a weird glitch where you're using it and it turns black for no reason. The screen turns black. You think it could be a multitude of problems, right? It could be maybe the battery has a bad connection, or maybe you have a setting that is malfunctioning, or maybe there's an issue with the screen, or the circuitry inside is not connecting well. So it could be all sorts of things. The scientific method would approach it one by one. So we would take, say you have 10 settings. It could be you leave 9 settings the same and just change the one, and doing it literally an experiment to test out that one. That doesn't work. Try another one. If you've ever done something like that, that's the scientific method in a nutshell. Your problem solving. You can do that with cars. Doctors do it when they're trying to diagnose people with stuff. All that. If you've ever done any troubleshooting, you're a scientist, basically. Let's talk about observation. This is very important in science. We need to be very specific when we're making observations. It's any time we're using our senses to gather information. It can be quantitative, it can be qualitative. For those of you in class, the sponge lab we did, we took some quantitative data, we weighed things, maybe took some volumes. That's numerical is quantitative. On the other hand, qualitative is descriptive. This next lab with the physical and chemical changes is going to involve a lot of qualitative observations. And just another scientific definition here, a system. That can be all sorts of things. If you're, think of an ecosystem. If you're studying fish and their behaviors, a fish tank might be your system. But if you're studying microorganisms and a pond water sample, the little dropper of pond water on a microscope slide, that might be your system. Meaning I kind of draw an imaginary line, an imaginary border around it, and then don't really involve myself with the other stuff. You see this a lot in physics. Like if I'm looking at the car, if I'm driving a car and a car is my system, I care more about the stuff inside the car and not necessarily the stuff outside the car. On the other hand, if like the town is my system, then the car is a part of that system. So you think about it, if you're driving at a constant speed and you toss a ball up in the air, when you're in the car, that ball just comes straight down to you. But somebody watching outside the car system, they're going to see the ball take like this parabola They're going to see the ball moving forward as it goes up and down. So different systems have different perspectives. That's why it's really important that we define a system. Especially in chemistry, system could be your experiment at your lab table. It could be a beaker. It could be the whole room or even the universe, depending on what information you care about. So once you define what you're studying, then you want to make a hypothesis. And we've had a little experience with this. Usually hypotheses are if-then statements. If I flip the light switch, then the room will get brighter somehow. Something I can test. What's that? Black magic. Yes. Yeah, sometimes it's not true, though. It can be proven false, my hypothesis. If I have the power, there's a power shut-off valve up here. If I have the key turned and all the power in the room shut off, then my hypothesis is false. If I flip the switch, in that case, the light doesn't turn on and my hypothesis is rejected. So I have to be very conditional about my hypothesis. I would revise it. That's turning the light on and having it not work. That's an experiment that tests my hypothesis. I could revise my hypothesis and say, if the power is on and I flip the light switch, then the lights will turn on. Then the magic will happen and the room will become bright. So that is how we make hypotheses, test them, and then revise them. The key to a hypothesis is it needs to be testable. I have to be able to show it false. If it's a statement that could never be proven false, it's not a good hypothesis. An example I give is think of aliens, UFOs. I could say there are no aliens in the universe. How would you prove that false? If I said there's no aliens in the universe, you can prove it false just by finding an alien, right? So that's a good hypothesis. If I said the opposite, if I said there are aliens in the universe, that's not a good hypothesis because I have to. How can you just constantly prove the negative? Like there's no aliens. Like it's very unreasonable to expect to prove that false. So think about that when you're making a hypothesis. Like, can I prove this false? Other things are like chocolate's the best ice cream flavor. How do you really? It's subjective. How do you really prove that false? Would not be a good hypothesis. Obviously strawberry. And a better hypothesis would be if I survey, 17 students in the school, then the majority will choose strawberry as their favorite flavor. So that would be a better way to word a hypothesis other than just strawberry is the best or chocolate's the best. I do agree on the strawberry. I like strawberry milk is my favorite flavor there. So here's some just practice making observations, talking about hypotheses a little bit. Notice the trends on the graph here. We have when I use no fertilizer versus when I use 10%, versus when I use 25%, versus when I use 50%. If I were to compare like no fertilizer to 10 fertilizer, I could make a hypothesis. If I add more fertilizer, I'll see more plant growth. And that would definitely support that hypothesis. And then even further supported would be if I use 25% fertilizer. However, it doesn't always work that way because if I double it to 50%, I get about the same plant growth. So there's a limit to my hypothesis. So I would have to revise that and say something like, if the up to 25%, if I add more phosphorus to my fertilizer, I will obtain more plant growth. With this one, what do you think is going on there with the tracks? What's it look like happening? Well, the blue is just me. That's a good observation. Blue could be water, but that's just me covering up the next step. So let's make a prediction. What do you think might happen? Like, what do you think those animals? Yeah, we can make inferences about what happened there after the 3 frames. So again, this would be more of a quantitative observation on the left, and then we have this as more of qualitative observations. And we can make several hypotheses about what happened using inferences. So I sort of referenced this with the light switch, but testing a hypothesis requires experimentation that we're going to collect data, like those observations we made, that will either support or refute our hypothesis. So when I test my hypothesis, it's very important that I keep everything constant, everything controlled. Let's say with a sponge lab, I want to compare 2 brands of sponges. I would only want to change the brand. I wouldn't want to use a different liquid for the 2 sponges, right? I want to keep it consistent and test how much water they both hold. I wouldn't want to change the temperature. Like, I don't want to test one sponge when it's real hot and humid in here and then test the other sponge when it's cold and dry. That could have an effect. So things like weather, temperature are things we want to control. Probably the amount of water. If I put like 5 drops of water in one sponge and a whole beaker's worth of water in the other sponge, that's not a good idea. Want to keep everything that you could possibly keep the same, keep the same. It's like with the phone example again. I wouldn't want to just willy-nilly change every single setting on my phone all at once, because then I'm like, I don't know which setting actually worked and which didn't. We just do one thing at a time, and that's my variable. The thing that I change is a condition in my variable. In the lab, we talked about independent and dependent variables. Independent variables are the ones you change. So with the fertilizer, that would be the phosphorus content, would be the, or I guess in this case, time would be an independent variable. The amount of time that went by, or the amount of fertilizer. Those are both things that are changed by the experiment. Whereas growth, I can't make the plant grow more. I can only affect the settings around it. So growth would be a dependent variable. It depends on what I changed. A couple more definitions here with theories. We probably think of a model. Well, there's a couple things you could probably think of when you think model. But in science, because a lot of times we use model to mean like the ideal scenario of something, the ideal object. But in science, it's more than just a physical object. A model is really an explanation. And it can be mathematical, like an equation. On the board you see in Chem 2, we're doing this ideal gas law. PV equals nRT. That's just a mathematical equation that models how gases behave under certain pressure, temperature, and volume conditions. It can be visual, it can be verbal. We're going to learn the atomic model that was changed over time. Different models scientists have used to represent the atom. We're going to make some molecular models using different tools. And then a theory, this is another thing that in everyday use means something kind of different. You might hear conspiracy theory, or, I have a theory that this is happening, or my theory is this or that. But in science, a theory is taking a whole bunch of scientific experiments into account and then generalizing them all to explain that. So we're going to learn about atomic theory, which takes all sorts of different experiments and puts them together to try to explain what's going on based on all these experiments that we see. how can we represent the atom best? So a theory explains the laws of nature, whereas a hypothesis is more of an educated guess. And I sort of gave you the answer there for this one. A theory is different because it has been subjected to more experimental testing. So the correct answer for that question in your notes is going to be C. And then I just have one last slide in this section talking about the scientific method. Like I said, there are sort of steps we would like to follow, but it doesn't always go this way. We make our observations, we collect data, we look at what's going on and what we want to study, and then you can even do some preliminary experimenting or communicating with others, do some research, see what others have already found out about your topic. And then once you've made some observations, you come up with a hypothesis, which, again, involves some inferring, predicting, classifying. It could be wrong, but once we come up with a hypothesis, we're going to test it. So my test will involve experiments, collecting data, measuring things. And then I might decide to go back and revise my hypothesis. If the data doesn't seem to match what my prediction was, I'll go back and change my hypothesis and test it again. And if my tests, lots of tests tend to agree, then I can go into theorizing. If you don't ever seem to see any inconsistencies with your tests, you can start to explain what's going on, construct a model about it, make more predictions, communicate, collaborate. Finally, you would tend to publish your results in what's called a peer-reviewed journal, where scientists put their papers in a journal, and other scientists will critique them, their science experiments, make sure they're doing things the proper way, look out for any issues. So it actually has to go through quite a process to be published. Not that there's not bad papers out there, but there is a community of scientists that tries to make sure they have the highest quality in different journals. And then, again, after you publish it, if other scientists can either validate that theory, or you can go back and figure out something different and start all over. So this is really more of a cyclical thing sometimes than just a straightforward step-by-step process. So that's the scientific method in a nutshell. We'll go over measuring when we come back.